now that the Russians are kind of being locked out of the dollar order, increasingly when they sell things to the Chinese are paying for them in renminbi. And that's resulted in a huge amount of renminbi accumulating in Russian banks in Moscow. So much so that it's become a cheap source of funding.
Hedge fund billionaire Ray Dalio has said that China could be the world's next great superpower. On this show, Peter Zion has said to me that China is probably on the brink of catastrophe. Where do you see China's economy in the near future?
If China is to become that great economic power that everyone for a generation now has been saying is kind of inevitable, it has got so many barriers and so many hurdles it's got to get over between now and then that, frankly, it kind of is looking increasingly unlikely. The big ones, are unquestionably the demographic cliff that China is facing. So its population is aging rapidly. The percentage of retirees is increasing aggressively. Hence, the balance between people in the workforce and the people who are retired and relying on people in the a smaller number of people in the workforce to generate economic growth. That imbalance is going to get bigger and bigger. And then on top of that, the absolute size of China's population is going to start shrinking aggressively. It's already shrinking, and it's just going to become more and more aggressive in its decline throughout the rest of the century. So that's the first big issue. The second issue is, China has already accumulated huge amounts of debt to drive its economic model over the past 20 years, and it's trying to work through that at the moment. And so, that as well is kind of presenting a headwind to its sort of economic fortunes. On top of that, you've kind of got the economic challenges it's facing because the United States is no longer willing to sort of perpetuate the economic relationship, which has kind of been foundational to China's economic rise over the past 30 years. So all of that stands in the way of China, sort of the inevitability of China, something that I think was broadly anticipated. China would inevitably become a larger economy than that of the United States. It would inevitably become a great power in its own right. And because of those barriers, those things are not necessarily going to occur. I think realistically, China's strength has always been premised on its ability to be able to grow quickly, and for its economic growth rate to remain at a fairly aggressive level relative to other economies. Now, we're at the point now where that no longer looks to be the case. It seems feasible that in the near future, China will be growing over the long term at 2%, 3%, maybe even longer. And that then raises maybe even lower, pardon me. So that then raises the question, a China that is growing at, at rates which are comparable, maybe marginally faster, maybe marginally slower than major developed economies, does that allow it to translate into a greater power status? And I think that is the real challenge. I mean, if it is only growing at 2% or 3%, does that allow it to challenge the United States for a great power status? Does that allow it to achieve that inevitability that we assumed that it was kind of baked into the cake? And I think increasingly it's looking as though that is not going to be the case.
If it's not the case, what comes next? Would we see a descent for China, or would it be a maintenance sort of period?
I think we're entering into a period of time, not just for China, but for many countries around the world, where it's difficult to say exactly what comes next, because we've never really been in this position where populations are sort of starting to shrink fairly aggressively. I mean, our entire model of economic growth for however long it's been has been premised on the idea of growth. And that the part and parcel of that is the populations kind of get bigger year on year, even if it's only by marginal amounts. And all of a sudden, China's population is going to decline aggressively. So what does that mean for the political system? What does it mean for its aspirations? What does it mean for the way it engages with its neighbours? And all of that is an open question at the moment. But in terms of the sort of signals that come out of China at the moment, it is certainly aware of its vulnerabilities. It talks a lot about the need to ensure security of supply. It talks about the need to, stimulate domestic demand and more equitably distribute wealth domestically, because it realizes that its economic model up until this point is not sustainable. There is this real understanding in the system that things have to change, but even though there is that understanding and there's a whole lot of talk about how things have to change, it's difficult to say how that will necessarily connect and interact with the reality of, say, radically slowing populations and a global trade regime that is kind of shifting beneath its feet as the United States takes on a new direction, or takes on is sort of changing the rules of global trade based on what it perceives as sort of new geopolitical realities.
Mm-hmm. So what can be done on the part of China to address this and to put up their best fight in the world?
I'm not sure necessarily what can be done. I mean, from where I sit, the most interesting thing is just kind of looking at what they are doing. So I think I found fascinating was in 2020 when Xi Jinping rolled out his vision of common prosperity. Now, it's taken a little bit of a backseat over the last couple of years because of COVID, because China remains very much committed to this what they call dynamic clearing, or what the rest of the world calls their zero COVID policy, whereby if enough cases of localized COVID pops up, then the entire city or the entire district gets shut down in order to keep a lock on this. Now, that's had a huge impact on both economic growth and its ability to kind of roll out or cultivate or kind of pursue this sort of new way economic, this vision of common prosperity. But nonetheless, I mean, we saw it even with Xi Jinping's report, his speech over the weekend at the 20th Party Congress. I mean, it was riddled throughout. All these comments that pertain to the economy were very much informed by this vision of common prosperity, which at its heart is about redistributing the way that wealth is allocated in the Chinese economy. But it's not just that. It's not about just taking from the haves and giving to the have-nots. It's very much tied up with this idea of like, hey, China's economy cannot continue to grow in the way that it has traditionally continued to grow, which has been debt-led investment in public works and housing. That is no longer sustainable. The way China has to grow in the future is by consuming more domestically, because even this export machine, that model of growth, that went out the window decades ago, but it's had a bit of a resurgence during COVID. Even that's not going to work anymore because the rest of the world cannot absorb increasing exports from China, because China's just too big. So China needs to grow in the way that the rest of the world grows, and that is it needs to consume more domestically. And that's sort of tied up into this idea of common prosperity as well, that it's not just a question of growing up the pie anymore, but the way that the pie is allocated has to be changed. And so resources, it's not just going from the haves to the have-nots, it's about taking them from the state sector, from the local governments who have monopoly over the ownership of land and of natural resources, and reallocating them to the private sector. And so doing the same thing with the state firms, which have access to subsidized or cheap credit, relatively low interest rate loans, very cheap access to land, effective monopoly control or influence over certain industries, and changing the way the system works such that some of those privileges which allow them to accumulate wealth are either broken down, or the wealth itself is redistributed to the public. And only that way will people be able to acquire a bigger part of the pie. I think it's also fascinating as well because there's been, particularly outside of China, there's been this sort of, one of the ways that we typically have perceived China's crackdown on the tech sector over the last couple of years is that it's an anti-private sector movement, right? That what we've seen is that Xi Jinping has shown his real colors, and that he's trying to weaken the private sector. It's a little bit more complicated than that. I think what we've really seen with the tech sector is it's been a pushback against private sector when it gets too big. I think it's been a pushback against the private sector when it no longer serves the state's interest. But at the same time, when it comes to small private sector firms, the government keeps talking about just how important they are to its vision of long-term prosperity. And so you kind of have this dividing line between the state or the party saying, yeah, we're not particularly in favor of large private sector firms because we lose control. They do things that we don't think are in the national interest. They exploit the effective monopoly that they have over the industries that they've built up. But small private sector firms, on the other hand, they are innovative. They are the ones who are responsible for driving employment in urban areas. They are the ones that generate economic growth and specifically household wealth. And so you read this stuff about common prosperity, and it's like we need to be able to give small firms and entrepreneurs the opportunity to succeed and to generate their own wealth. So there's some really interesting ideas that sort of the Chinese state and the party are talking about. I think this is how our future kind of looks like in the future, how we sort of perpetuate the expanding of the economic pie and its reallocation into the future. But the question is, of course, are they able to do it? And there's a couple of reasons why that will be difficult. And of course, the first is COVID, because a lot of this stuff feels like it's been pushed to the back seat until the economy is back on its feet again. And the second thing is vested interests. I mean, nobody wants to give up their wealth and no one wants to give up their privileges. And I think a great example is, one of the ways that the state has been trying to support small private sector firms during COVID is like, well, a lot of small firms, their landlords are large state-owned enterprises because state-owned firms, regardless of what industry they are in, have managed to accumulate huge amounts of land. And so those state-owned firms have been told to give private companies rent holidays, or at least to cut their rent significantly for however many months into the future. But the state regulator for state-owned enterprises just came out last week and said, look, a lot of you aren't doing it. We told you at the beginning of the year this has to happen, but you're not cutting rents and you're not doing it aggressively enough. It's one of those things that would be just such an easy way to provide support for the private sector during this period of COVID, and also a great way to reallocate wealth in the system. And yet vested interests, it's just too easy for them to push back and not to do it. Mm-hmm. So I think that's kind of one of the things that I'm sort of interested in looking at. There is a real sense that the way that the economy works, the way the system operates, and the way that wealth is allocated throughout that system has to change. But I think it's going to be slow going, and there is going to be potential pushback in the system against it happening.
Mm-hmm. And we're discussing Xi Jinping and his vision for the long term. What do you see with Xi Jinping's unprecedented third term coming? What does that mean for China?
The short answer is I'm not really sure. When we're talking about things like common prosperity, it's under a previous generation of leaders who kind of come in for 2 5-year terms. If you rolled out something like that in the last 18 months of your term, you wouldn't necessarily have great ambitions that it would necessarily be carried on into the next generation of leadership in a form that you anticipated. What Xi Jinping did, though, is that this is kind of his flagship economic platform. He introduced it to the world 18 months before the end of his second term, and he was able to do it because he fully anticipated being in power for at least another term, and who knows how long after that. So I think what it means is that some of these policies that he's rolled out in recent years are going to be with us for some time, whether it be the Belt and Road Initiative, Common Prosperity, or whatnot. But what it means for China beyond that, I'm not really sure. I think there's much to be said for any system that institutionalizes some mechanism to cycle their leaders out and then bring in a new cycle of leaders, fresh blood, new ideas. The system doesn't ossify. Of course, I'm sure there are arguments that to be made that with the Chinese system, when you kind of cycle out a generation of leaders every 5 to 10 years, the amount of patronage that has sort of goes out the door, and sort of the political jockeying and whatnot isn't necessarily great for stability, and perhaps cultivates corruption in some areas. But ultimately, I think it's being able to get rid of a previous generation of leaders is kind of a circuit breaker, that kind of allows for a replenishing of I guess, vision, and more importantly, it's kind of a way to sort of deal with sort of ossification of the system as well. So I think it's doesn't set a great precedent for the future, but actually what it means for the immediate future, for the years ahead, I think it's still a bit of an open question.
Mm-hmm. And you've written a very thorough report about China's vision for their currency, how they're moving to spread their currency around the world, and how that could increase their influence in Asia or in the entire world. What do you see for the yuan and for currency in China?
So China rolled out this idea that it wanted to turn the renminbi into an international currency in 2009. But I think there is a sense globally, and certainly I think to a certain extent within China as well, that's really been quite the failure. It's been a bit of a dead letter. So for over a decade, they've been striving towards making the renminbi an international currency, and they really don't have much to show for it. And that's not to say that they've given up on the idea, and quite the contrary. I think since 2017, 2018, there's kind of been this sea change in the way that they perceive how they should be driving renminbi internationalization. And if anything, the importance of achieving it has only mounted, particularly over the last couple of years. When the Chinese look at how America has deployed the dollar as a weapon, most notably against Russia for its invasion of the Ukraine, but incrementally over the past decade against Iran, Afghanistan, there's been a real sense that China does not want to be in a position where the same thing happens to it, that it effectively gets cut out of the dollar system, because it is so dependent on the dollar for so much of what it does globally. So for paying for its imports, for it's what it gets paid for its exports and whatnot. That's part of the issue, and I think there's also been this increasing frustration that the Chinese believe that the US, even though the dollar is effectively the global currency, that the United States does not manage the dollar, does not manage its own monetary policy with the best interests of the globe in mind. The US and the Federal Reserve purely administers monetary policy, in the interests of the United States, and that has detrimental effects to China specifically, and to the countries around the world more globally. And I think we're seeing that very much so at the moment. So China's critique of the global currency order and its belief that the renminbi needs to play a greater role is something that's just sharpened, if anything, over the last few years, even as it's become increasingly clear that no one really wants to use the renminbi. So it then comes up with this question of, well, what's the Chinese going to do about it? And I think for the first, let's say, 10 years of renminbi internationalization, what Beijing was trying to do, and China's central bank was trying to do, it was setting up conditions under which the rest of the world could use the renminbi. Because up until that point, you couldn't really transact in renminbi across borders. Renminbi wasn't allowed to accumulate outside of China, except with perhaps in cash. I mean, there just wasn't a way to use the renminbi to really do anything. And so the process from 2009 onwards was about allowing the renminbi to be used. But what they didn't do during that process is they didn't really give anyone a reason for why they should be using the renminbi. And that's what started to change since 2018. They're trying to do two things, right? On one hand, they're trying to create a cycle whereby renminbi flows out of the country and then flows back in again. I mean, that's almost the definition of an international currency. There's demand for it offshore, and then there's a demand for it to flow back in again. And so they're trying to set up that cycle. At the same time, they're trying to create reasons for people to use the renminbi rather than other currencies. And that's incredibly difficult, because the reason people don't use renminbi and they tend to use the dollar instead when they're given a choice is that the dollar is just so much easier to use. It is cheaper. It's got these developed offshore derivatives markets that allow you to sort of hedge foreign currency risk. Even in Hong Kong, I mean, you hear Hong Kong bankers complain, even when customers want to use renminbi for whatever transaction it is, sometimes it takes time to actually secure the renminbi that they need to do the transaction. Whereas, I mean, dollar is just globally ubiquitous, and so it's cheaper, it's easier, it's more readily available. Why would you use anything else? And so China's kind of operating under the understanding of like, okay, well, we can't challenge the dollar in terms of convenience and ease of use. We kind of have to set up certain mechanisms whereby the renminbi just becomes the obvious choice of currency to use under certain circumstances. And so that's kind of what they're focused on at the moment. So this kind of falls into two buckets, right? As I said, it's all about cycling renminbi in and out. So how to get renminbi out of the country? Well, they're focused very much on trade, so that they want to be able to, for when they're importing goods from overseas, they want to be able to pay for it in renminbi. And so the sorts of things that they're focused on is, one, commodities markets. There's this big frustration in China that, commodities are typically traded in US dollars. And the reason that's the case is because commodities futures markets, where commodities are priced, are almost mainly in the United States. There's a few in the UK, but all of them effectively use the dollar. And the frustration is that, that may have made sense a century ago when the US was the big industrial power. It was producing commodities and it was using them. These days, China is the biggest consumer of most industrial and agricultural commodities. And so surely it makes more sense for these things to be priced in China rather than the US. And so this is a big part of what they're focusing on. How do they start to get certain commodities priced in renminbi on Chinese commodity exchanges rather than the United States? This is a long-term project. This is not the sort of thing that's going to happen overnight. I mean, I'd be surprised if they can pull this off in a decade. But they're finally starting to open up their commodities markets to foreign investment, which is just a starting point. For these markets to be globally relevant, they have to have more and more foreign money in them. Also, what they're trying to do is introduce commodity contracts for commodities that don't have futures contracts elsewhere in the world. So this idea that there are new emerging markets or industries, particularly in green tech and low carbon industries, that are going to require certain minerals and industrial inputs that don't yet have futures contracts. So China's trying to launch these and get in on the ground floor and become the focal point for trading these sorts of commodities. But that is the vision. Can they kind of wrest control for at least some products away from the US? So that's a big part of what they're trying to do. At the same time, what they want to do is change the way that Asian supply chains are priced. Because at the moment, pretty much, although most Asian supply chains sort of seem to snake their way through China at some point, because even though lots of components are made in Southeast Asia and in East Asia, ultimately they end up in China for assembling or whatever. But those supply chains are typically priced in dollars. And China thinks, okay, we've got to do something whereby these Asian supply chains ultimately are priced in renminbi as well. And this kind of comes back to what I was saying about domestic consumption, because the thing that drives or thing that determines what currency a supply chain is typically invoiced in is the end user of the product of that supply chain. So it doesn't matter who's making the thing. It's a question of who at the very end of the day goes to their supermarket or jumps onto Amazon or goes to the store and buys it in their hometown. And that invariably, the biggest consumer is invariably the United States. So if China wants to do that, then the stuff that gets made in Asia has to be bought by the Chinese, not as a step towards then on-selling it to the United States or Europe. The Chinese have to be the end consumer. And so conceivably, they might be able to change the way that Asian supply chains are invoiced, but that also requires a very fundamental change in the way the Chinese economy works so that it consumes more. And there's a couple of other things that they're trying to do as well. One I think would be particularly interesting is relates to BRI, so the Belt and Road Initiative. So I think there's this, from the very early days that the Belt and Road Initiative were kind of launched in, I think Xi Jinping first talked about the idea in 2013. It was linked with the idea that, hey, maybe this thing will help promote the internationalization of the renminbi, but it just didn't. The vision was that, you've got a whole lot of developing countries that are in dire need of credit to build infrastructure that they don't have. Surely they would be willing to accept loans in renminbi, and yet they haven't been. They need the credit, but they always want the loans in dollars and to a lesser extent in euros. Because once they receive the renminbi, well, what are they going to do with it? They kind of would then need to transfer it almost immediately into some other currency. So increasingly, there's this idea in China of like, okay, well, maybe the focus of BRI has been too much on infrastructure in the first place. Perhaps what we should be doing more of is encouraging the construction of industrial production facilities, so factories moving out of China into developing economies, and that these factories can be set up with renminbi loans, that those loans are then used to buy capital goods from China to set up those factories, because China makes machine tools, it makes factory components, and then when those factories start producing stuff, that stuff then that gets sold back to China for renminbi. So effectively, you have this circuit, this loop, whereby factories overseas are funded by renminbi. The renminbi is used to buy facilities from China, and then when the factories start producing goods, they sell to China in return for renminbi. And so there's this idea. It has happened on a fairly small scale. There was a great example of the Russians setting up an LNG facility up in the Arctic. It was partially funded by renminbi-denominated loans from China Development Bank and Exim Bank. Those loans were used to buy sort of industrial facilities that were being made bespoke by, I think, 100 odd China, or maybe it was 40 odd Chinese firms that sort of made what was needed for this sort of floating rig in the Arctic, and sort of sent it north. And they got paid in renminbi by those renminbi loans. And then the chairman of the LNG company said that it'd be willing to sell LNG to China in renminbi. And so it's that kind of cycle that will potentially also help cultivate the use of renminbi. So as I said at the beginning, the focus at the moment is in terms of renminbi internationalization is this realization that up until now, foreigners have been able to use renminbi, but they haven't had a real reason to do it. And so the focus is now to kind of create mechanisms whereby it makes sense for foreigners to use the renminbi because China has been able to change some way the way that global trade works, whether it be in the pricing of commodities, whether it be the invoicing of supply chains, or whether it be in sort of Chinese investment going abroad, not in infrastructure specifically, but industrial production.
Mm-hmm. And we're talking about convenience here. What function does the digital renminbi or the ECNY have in that convenience for international currency?
That's still a bit of an open question, because the Chinese have said time and time again that the focus of the ECNY is it's domestic. It is about access, particularly for people in parts of the country who have limited exposure to financial services. It's about helping them. I think it's about being a backup digital payment system for Ali and Tencent. It's moved a lot more slowly when it comes to cross-border digital payments, and its importance and its significance to cross-border trade will only become apparent when China settles on the rules and the circumstances under which it is willing to allow renminbi to be used overseas. So conceivably, it might not even allow the digital renminbi to exist outside of China's borders, under which case, it could potentially be, that it would have to be exchanged for another currency at the board, at sort of China's digital borders. But of course, I mean, we don't know yet. So it would really come down to the rules that China wishes to apply to the ECNY. And at the same time, it will also come down to, because for sort of currencies to be used for cross-border trade as it is, it also requires sort of negotiation between governments and between central banks to kind of set up the bureaucratic and the legal framework that allows trade and transactions to go on. And so there's a lot that kind of really has to happen first before we can kind of say with great certitude as to how the ECNY is going to be used globally. Now, just to take a step back from all of that, there is always that question of like, hey, is this going to be the thing that allows China to, clearly it's had problems with internationalizing its currency. Is this going to be the thing that allows it to leapfrog it? Is this kind of like the killer app, so to speak? And the reality is it just really isn't. And Chinese officials say this. The former governor of the PBOC, the People's Bank of China, says it explicitly as well. It's like, if anything, the ECNY helps, but it's not the sort of thing that's going to be able to drive renminbi internationalization. It's about infrastructure. It's ultimately a tool. It's something that will potentially make cross-border trade, easier and more convenient. But the underlying issues here is that the rest of the world kind of has to be willing to use the renminbi regardless of what form that currency takes. And so that comes down to faith in the Chinese currency, the faith that the Chinese currency will retain its value, faith in the PBOC's ability and willingness to maintain a stable monetary policy, faith that once you hold this currency, that it will be readily exchanged. You can exchange it under, in your own time, under your own terms, whenever you want another currency. There needs to be a reason to hold it. So, I mean, the reason people like holding dollars is because you can do so much with it. There is, you have this huge, vast financial system that has dollars that, is so much bigger and diversified and has so many more opportunities than perhaps any other currency in the world. And at the moment, China doesn't have that, although it kind of increasingly it's reforming its capital markets with one eye on the idea that, hey, we need to provide those opportunities in renminbi if we want our currency to be international. So, having a digital currency will make cross-border transaction easier, regardless of ultimately what the rules look like and how China negotiates with other countries in legal terms and whatnot, how it will allow the renminbi to be used. But ultimately, it's just a tool. It is the infrastructure. Underlying all that people have to have a reason for wanting to use the renminbi and for wanting to hold the renminbi, and people also have to have faith in the system, that sort of the underlying financial and political system that backs the renminbi. And China's authorities are trying to move forward on all those fronts at once, but ultimately the ECNY is just a tool that kind of will help with the convenience rather than the underlying forces that sort of drive a currency internationalization.
Mm-hmm. And to this idea of faith in the digital renminbi, I understand that it's got some similarities to what we might understand as blockchain technology, sort of a distributed ledger, and yet it seems that if it's under the control of the Chinese Communist Party, that perhaps it's programmable, that it could even be set to expire. How does the currency really work in this digital form?
It is programmable, and it's deliberately so. I mean, the Chinese want this thing to be able to be flexible and to kind of give them more options when it comes to monetary policy and making social security allocations or distributing stimulus money throughout the economy. So that's I think the authorities see that as a feature rather than a bug. But as for I'm not the person to get too far down into the weeds. When it became increasingly, when I started this renminbi internationalization project with my research partner, the ECNY was our starting point. We thought that this was the thing that China was really doing to try and push the envelope with this, together with its development of its cross-border payment system, SIPS, which is partially a kind of an alternative to SWIFT. We thought these two things together, more than anything, were the clearest indication that China was pushing more aggressively, once again, its ambitions to make the renminbi an international currency. And then the more we dug into it, it became increasingly clear to us that these were just infrastructure issues, and that the real forces that were going to reshape whether the renminbi became an international currency were kind of the sort of stuff I was talking about before. So in the end, originally I thought maybe I would spend a lot more time kind of understanding the nuts and bolts of how the ECNY works. But when it became clear that it was kind of a bit of a sideshow to the internationalization issue, I didn't end up going down that rabbit hole.
Mm-hmm. What do you see happening with China's currency in Central America? It seems there are projects popping up there, but it's not exactly clear to me, at least, what the ends are in getting involved there.
When it comes to the currency, I think the only place at the moment where it's really of any significance, where we're seeing real headway being made in terms of the currency being used, and willingly so, is in Russia. And for fairly obvious reasons. So now that the Russians are kind of being locked out of the dollar order, increasingly when they sell things to the Chinese are paying for them in renminbi, and that's resulted in a huge amount of renminbi accumulating in Russian banks in Moscow. So much so that renminbi's become a cheap source of funding. And so we've already seen over the last couple of months 3 large Russian resources companies, I think we're talking gas, oil, gas, aluminium, and gold, have all issued renminbi-denominated bonds. And of course, it makes sense. They're raising debt in renminbi because, they're selling their goods to China in renminbi, so they can pay off the debt with effectively the currency that they're earning in. And I think that's perhaps the most interesting development for the renminbi, not just because it's happening in a particular country, but it kind of speaks volumes about sort of the potential for how the renminbi might sort of gradually push forward in the near future. Because, for most of the post-Second World War era, the dollar has kind of been it's been a common good, a global common good. It's been an essential part of the Pax Americana. Everyone had access to it, and so that was what allowed kind of the free flow of trade and global finance. Of course, I'm exaggerating here, but that was kind of the basic parameters. It was part of the US contract with the world, but increasingly it's gone from being this common good to being a walled garden. Now, at the moment, that garden is huge. The few countries that are outside of those walls are fairly marginal. It's Iran, Afghanistan, North Korea, Russia. But the question then becomes, does that change over time? I mean, the US has clearly recognized that the dollar is and access to the US financial system is an incredibly powerful weapon, an incredibly useful tool when it comes to pursuing geopolitical goals. So is Russia the end of it? Does it get deployed again? Who does it get deployed against? Under what circumstances? And I guess what I'm getting at is, does that garden get smaller and smaller? And does that garden get smaller explicitly because of the wishes of the United States? And then if you're outside of that garden, what do you use to transact in? What currency do you use to transact in? And clearly the Russians, given the amount of trade that they do with China, they're using the renminbi. So I think that's the thing that I think is kind of worth watching in the near term is, regardless of everything I said before about how China is trying to pursue on its own terms renminbi internationalization, I think one of the things to watch is, does the US perhaps open up space for the renminbi to be used because the US willingly abandons the field for certain countries that it no longer wants transacting in its own dollar system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it seems a network effect kind of question, and also maybe for China a bit of a chicken and the egg thing. How do you make demand for your currency outside of your country. What can China be doing to generate more demand or more trust?
Well, this is one of the other things I didn't, bring up before. But as I said, there's this cycle it wants to generate, right? It wants renminbi flowing out into the system, and then it wants it flowing back in again. So it's that second part, the flowing back in, which is all about generating demand. And this comes down to their capital markets. I mean, one of the reasons that so much money flows into the United States is because it has the biggest, most transparent, capital markets in the world, where there is just opportunities there that just don't exist for most other countries because because it's just so big. And of course, because everybody trades in dollars, it makes sense to hold dollars in reserve and whatnot. And so China at the moment is trying to, reform its capital markets because traditionally its capital markets have been a fairly marginal part of its financial system. The core of how it has always financed industry and trade has always been the banking system, and that it's trying to change. So develop its bond market, make its stock markets bigger and whatnot. And so that's going to be a long-term project. But clearly it's something that they've been striving for the last few years, and we're going to see more reform on that front. But then the question is, okay, well, how do you, so you're kind of creating an inward flow of money back into the Chinese economy, but specifically what the Chinese want is not just money flowing into China, they want renminbi flowing into China. So rather than dollars coming into China, where they get exchanged for renminbi, and then they accumulate in China's foreign exchange reserves, which the Chinese then go back and use to buy American treasuries, which honestly they don't want anymore. They've changed the system such that they have been opening up more and more channels to allow foreign investment into China's capital markets. However, the proviso or the constraint on almost all of these channels is that they don't let foreigners bring foreign currency into China. They require foreigners to first acquire renminbi outside of China, which they then bring in. So you've got almost an alphabet soup of kind of channels through which people can bring in money into China these days. You've got the CIBM, the China Interbank Bond Market channel. You've got what they call Bond Connect. The Shanghai Hong Kong Connect, the Shenzhen Hong Kong Connect, the London Hong Kong Connect. You've got the Wealth Connect, the Swap Connect, the QFI. You've got all these channels which allow money to flow in, and almost all of them these days, particularly the ones that have been set up since 2017, explicitly require foreigners to, like, if you want to bring your money in, first you have to exchange your foreign currency for renminbi, for CNH outside of the currency, and then the country, and then bring it in. And so here you've effectively created this sort of instant demand for offshore renminbi simply by saying that if you want to invest in our capital markets, that's fine, but the condition is that you're not bringing in foreign currency, you're bringing in renminbi that you've sourced from overseas. And so that's kind of the other side of that cycle. They're trying to push renminbi out through things like, ultimately long-term is like, commodities, pricing of commodities and supply chains and what I was saying before about BRI. But then on the other hand, it's coming back in through the capital market, but these rules that I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm. What can be done to make those capital markets in China more attractive? In reading your previous book, China's Great Wall of Debt, it seems that there's just a lot of question about what's really happening in China, how much influence the government has, how much trust you would really have in putting your money there in the first place.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And that's the sort of stuff that they're trying to fix at the moment. So I mean, this is a long-term project, but it's clearly something that they're trying to change. So, for example, traditionally, if you were a company that wanted to do an IPO in China, that the only way you could do an IPO is if you had express approval from the securities regulator, the CSRC. And so that was great. You have the explicit seal of approval from the state if you as a company eventually do an IPO. But that created a whole lot of problems as well. One, it created backlogs. So the capital markets were never able to provide, were never able to provide the capital that was required by firms at any given time because it took so much time for the regulator to provide approvals. So that was the first issue. Secondly, if stock prices fell and the state wanted to build them up again, all of a sudden you'd have a moratorium on IPOs. And so again, this important channel for raising capital for firms would get shut off for indeterminate periods of time because the state wouldn't approve IPOs anymore. And the third issue here was that it then created difficulties, or almost kind of like a political barrier to short selling or even really critical research. Because if the state had approved a company's IPO, then the state had a vested interest in ensuring that nobody exposed corruption, fraud, bad behavior at the company that was listed, because they'd given their seal of approval. They were responsible for people investing their money into this company. What happens if it turned out to be dodgy? And so you kind of had that sort of incentive structure that really prevented meaningful reform. What's happening now is that China is trying to gradually move the system over to one that looks more like the United States, where the regulator isn't responsible for giving its seal of approval for IPOs, but rather the system takes over. Now that's important, but it's also difficult, because all of a sudden it means that the auditors and the underwriters, the investment banks, and same thing's happening with the bond market, but with the bond market, the important part of the picture are the credit rating agencies. All of a sudden, these institutions become far more important in being able to vet securities before they come to market. And traditionally, they haven't had that responsibility. Yeah, they've had to put together prospectuses, and they've had to put together credit rating credit reports and audits, but it was less impactful. It was less important, because ultimately the important decisions were being made by the state. Now these institutions have to take on that role and responsibility for being able to say whether a company is a legitimate investment, and kind of to be able to sort of express and communicate the risk of investing in a certain firm or a certain security in a way that they probably didn't have to in the past. And so this is sort of the change that's trying to go on at the moment. And we've seen some very interesting court cases, particularly for credit rating agencies over the last couple of years, where the ratings agencies have been raked over the coals for like dodgy dealings and effectively selling ratings, and for new regulations are out there because of a realization that all the ratings on average were way too high. So the authorities are trying to change the system and force the gatekeepers to take on responsibility that the regulators are now backing away from. So it's this sort of stuff which is important, but we're talking about cultural changes here to the way the entire system works, and this is going to take time, assuming that it can kind of work at all. But this is the sort of stuff where you were kind of hinting at. I mean, traditionally, the system is opaque. There's a lot of risk in there that we can't properly identify. Is it really worth even investing in these markets? China's trying to change the infrastructure to kind of make it make the system less opaque. But I mean, we're at the early stages.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as you said, this is a challenge of understanding culture. And one thing that you bring to all your journalism is that you're fluent in Mandarin. You've lived in China for so many years. For people who are outside of China trying to understand it, what would you say the perception is in China for people who are business people? Are they happy? Are they frustrated? What is it like to be in that position in a system like this, in a culture like this?
I'm afraid, Brendan, I've been away too long myself these days. I've been, in the States now I've been in the States now for 7 years. And it is increasingly difficult to kind of really gauge what things are like on the ground. I mean, COVID has made it impossible even to kind of go back for short trips to reconnect with people. And certainly, sort of the openness of, China's just is not as open as it was, when I was there. So trying to kind of, really gauge how people feel and think is increasingly difficult, particularly at a distance.
Mm-hmm. And did you meet your wife there too?
I did. She's American, but we both
Oh,
met
okay.
at studying together in Nanjing.
Oh, very cool. Very cool. Well, Denny, before we get to some questions from the audience, where should folks look for you online if they want to learn more about your work?
I don't have much of a presence online these days, but I'd suggest people check out the report that we did on renminbi internationalization. It's called dollar decoupling, and it is the best place to find it is at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. That's the DC think tank that we wrote the report for. If you check out the Wilson Center's website and find our report there, that's probably the best place to check out my most recent work.
Great. Well, we'll put links to that in the description and to your book, China's Great Wall of Debt. And Denny, now for some questions from the audience. The first one is, if China sinks into a depression, what response could we expect from Chinese people, Chinese government, and what impact might that have on Western manufacturing in China?
If it slips into depression, I challenge the premise of the question because I don't think that's necessarily our starting point. And the other thing is, let's say China did slip into some sort of depression. There's going to be a lot that happens between now and that particular point. The current leadership has clearly got a far higher tolerance for slower economic growth than anything up until this point. And I think the reason that they're tolerant of slower economic growth is they kind of realize the system that's been generating fast economic growth is not only unsustainable, but it's actually been building up the potential causes of sources of weakness and sources of destruction for the economic system. So, although we've seen significantly slower growth at the moment, I think as much as anything, it is because the leadership is kind of like, okay, well, we have to do this now to prevent larger problems being stored up, in the future. Now, of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that, they're in a position to kind of ramp things up again when they want to. And I think we're seeing this a little bit with the property sector at the moment. I mean, clearly the authorities aren't hugely happy about the extent to which property demand has fallen off a cliff, and they're kind of throwing everything at the moment to get everything they've got at the moment to get people buying again. They're cutting the minimum mortgage rate. In some places, they've said, hey, look, local authorities can get rid of the minimum mortgage rate entirely. They're cutting down payments. They're doing all sorts of stuff to get people buying again, and people just aren't buying. So I think there are certain circumstances under which the authorities have proven themselves. I mean, we always kind of assume that this being a sort of a one-party state, that they can kind of turn things up and turn things down again. And it's partly that they have been able to do that for the past 20 years because the sort of growth that they've been pursuing is investment-led. You turn it up with more debt, you build more stuff. You turn it down with less debt, you build less stuff. But when you're kind of looking at parts of the economy that are dependent on the individual decisions of households, things get a little bit more difficult. So that's, I think, what you're seeing with the property sector at the moment. But, sliding into depression, I think, I'm not quite sure the circumstances under necessarily which that would happen. I'd assume it would have to be, preceded with a financial crisis. But I think at the moment, the authorities have proven themselves pretty adept at kind of, preventing an outright crisis. Their financial system does not operate in the same way as ours does, because if for no other reason that the authorities are very hands-on in preventing the sort of runs on institutions, which are kind of a bedrock of kind of crises as they emerge overseas. If anything, they are very hands-on in sort of shutting down the potential for contagion to spread very quickly. So I don't think necessarily depression is kind of a good starting point to kind of think about where things might end up. I think realistically, we're talking about just significantly lower growth. Now, when that happens, let's say we're growing at less than 2% a year. what does that mean for China? What does it mean for Chinese people? Yeah, again, it's sort of complicated by this aging population thing, right? Because on one hand, China doesn't need to create the vast number of new jobs that it did, say, 10 years or 20 years ago. However, the new jobs it needs to create are for the millions of university graduates that are graduating from school every year. So it's not enough to kind of have ditch digging or construction gigs anymore. They need to kind of be higher value added jobs. At the same time, the state needs to be able to be confident in its ability to pay social security. It needs to be able to improve the quality of its healthcare system. And so by extension, I think it's fair to assume that the fiscal burdens on the state are going to increase regardless of whether growth is at 1% or at 4% or at 5%. The very nature of demand, that the demands on the Chinese state are going to change radically over the next few years because of population changes, because of aging, because of the nature of new people coming into the workforce, because of the nature of internal migration and the size of it between cities and the countryside. And I think all of that will be complicated by slower growth. But what it means for for people's aspirations, what it means for them about what they expect from life or what they expect from the government, I find that incredibly difficult to foresee at the moment, because it's a completely new, almost a completely new world that we're entering into.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that leads well into the next question, which is for the government. What mechanisms do you think that the Chinese Communist Party has to deal with discontent and inflation in their population?
I think at the moment, inflation hasn't really been a problem. I think they've done an incredibly, it just hasn't really, spiked up. I mean, it does for certain goods. I mean, you have trouble sometimes with pork, you've had trouble sometimes with coal, but for the most part, inflation hasn't been a problem in China as it has been in the United States. In terms of controlling discontent, I mean, discontent, they've been fine tuning this for the last 10, 15 years, even longer. I mean, the potential for large scale discontent to kind of pop up and kind of really be a threat to political stability, it's just kind of not there so much at the moment. So yeah, in terms of the way that it controls the internet, in terms of its sort of surveillance apparatus, both in public and online, it's just, yeah. I mean, I kind of struggle in some ways to kind of see how discontent actually filters through in sort of a meaningful way in China these days to kind of really, change or threaten or sort of political stability.
Mm-hmm. Dinny, I'd just love to get your opinion on the last few sentences of your book and maybe how your opinions may have changed or remain the same. You wrote, "This century is supposed to be China's century, the result of 40 years of hard-won prosperity off the back of tough-minded reform and sacrifice. That still might happen, but it will require a radical change from China's current course. Instead, it looks poised to suffer a painful and uncertain end to its economic miracle." How do you see that now?
I'm less certain about the painful end, because at the time when I was writing that, shadow banking was still running amok. The authorities, it looked like they'd completely lost control of the financial system. And it felt like at some point this thing has to break. It's just getting bigger and bigger. It's not even clear that the authorities have a proper grasp of the extent of the problems. And so something will break. But around the same time that the book came out, something changed in the system. They launched a deleveraging campaign, which is best considered really a de-risking campaign. And pretty much for the last 4 or 5 years, they've really been really aggressive about reasserting control over the financial system, disposing of non-performing loans, massively shrinking down the shadow banking sector. The amount of control they now have over the financial system seems completely unimaginable from the time that I was writing that book. So what I originally envisioned as being a painful readjustment, largely because they were losing control, or they'd lost control of the financial system. I don't see the same sort of pain anymore, but I think the reality is that the days of rapid Chinese growth, to which we were all kind of accustomed, that we had this sort of vision that China was kind of heading in one direction, and it was like that. It was just a period of time before it took over from the United States as the biggest economy, and everything that kind of went with that. None of that's a given anymore, and it's increasingly unlikely. I think the really interesting thing about the property sector is, the government deliberately brought about this deleveraging of the property sector in the full knowledge of knowing that it would involve some pain. But I think the reality is, once this is done, the property will not contribute to economic growth in the way that it did prior to 2020. And that means that by its very nature, economic growth is going to be smaller, because the authorities aren't going to let property run amok the way that it used to. So I think, we'll probably see something similar with local governments as well, who've been, hugely important to stimulating economic growth through infrastructure construction. But local government finances are just so overstretched at the moment. And if anything, they've got worse during COVID, because Beijing has rolled out all these tax cuts, which have affected local governments' fiscal revenue. The tax cuts were in effort to sort of, improve the health of small and large firms alike, and households. And at the same time, because of what's happening in the property sector, there's just less demand for new land sales, which has also been a huge source of local government revenue. So, the system, all these drivers of growth in the past, they're just not sustainable anymore. The government it clearly recognizes that, and it doesn't want them to drive growth anymore. And so there will be pain throughout the system, in ways that we don't necessarily anticipate at the moment. But I think ultimately what we're looking at is just a China that grows more slowly. And a China that grows more slowly isn't going to be sort of its ability to sort of influence the globe. And even put that aside, I think the way that we see China will radically change if it's growing at 2 or 3%, than the days where it was growing anywhere between 7 and 10%. And so I think that's kind of what the future holds. If anything, I'm more convinced that sort of that vision of China's inevitability was misplaced. But I think in terms of how the future shakes out, I think that sort of, that sort of the ability of kind of a kind of violent disruption and a painful adjustment, there certainly still will be an adjustment, but I'm not convinced it'll be as disruptive internally as it once was, as I once thought it might be. But the big issue is, I think it'll just gradually, what's the quote? This is how the world ends, not with a bang, but a whimper. I think ultimately that's what we're going to see. It's going to be more of a whimper than a bang.
Mm-hmm. Well, Dinny, thank you for using your skills to do the thorough research and to communicate this to the rest of us. I really appreciate you spending your time with me. Thank you.
Not at all, Brennan. It's been lovely talking to you.
Thanks for watching this episode. To help get more great guests on the show, be sure to subscribe.